So I want to go ahead and welcome everyone to the Alden Kindred of America's presentation of After the Mayflower, a struggling colony expands. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the executive director. The Alden Kindred preserves and shares the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Alden at their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts, through guided tours, educational programs like this, genealogy research, exhibitions, and publications. I'd like to offer a special welcome today to our members who are joining us and whose support helps make programs like this possible. If you're interested in learning more about the Alden Kindred, please visit us at alden.org. On this very brisk spring afternoon, we are delighted to welcome the Reverend Dr. Warren Beckett-Soule for his talk about the ships that followed the Mayflower, bringing new passengers to the struggling Plymouth colony. It's a sometimes fascinating, often inspiring, and occasionally tragic tale. Dr. Soule is a scholar, professor, and priest, currently serving as the pastor of St. Margaret of Scotland Catholic Church in North Carolina. A descendant of several Mayflower families, including the Aldens. He is on the board of numerous Mayflower groups and is an editor for the Mayflower Silver Book series. Dr. Soule is a graduate of Davidson College, the Episcopal Divinity School, the University of Dallas, and Harvard University. He also holds a certificate in genealogical research from Boston University. He's taught at numerous international universities, including Oxford, and he serves and has served as an Anglican and Catholic parishes in the United States and the United Kingdom. After this talk, we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question and answer function on your screen. If you have to leave early or would like to share this program with others, a recording will be posted on the Alden website. And now we are very honored to welcome Beckett-Soule.
Thank you very much, Desiree. And it's really great to be here and to talk about the first couple of years after the Mayflower left. The Mayflower left Plymouth in April of 1621, and at the rate of about one a year, for the next 3 years, some major attempts were made in order to reinforce the colony. The first being the Fortune in 1621, then the Paragon, which, although it was supposed to come to Plymouth, never actually made it, and then the Little James and the Anne in 1623. I did a series of articles which appeared in the Mayflower Quarterly last year on each one of these, and so this is going to take some of these and expand them in this presentation. So starting with 1621, in April of 1621, the Mayflower left in order to go back to England. Then, let's see. There we go. The Fortune arrived in Cape Cod, in the Cape Cod area, on the 9th of November in 1621. That's the old style date. Almost exactly 1 year after the Mayflower had arrived. The ship strangely remained at the tip of the Cape for some time, which caused the natives in the area to be alarmed, thinking that it might be a hostile French vessel. Upon hearing reports of this strange vessel. Governor Bradford had Miles Standish arm his militia and load the cannon on the top of Burial Hill in case of an attack by the French. It took the ship several weeks to find Plymouth because they had no idea where to go. They couldn't just simply text them and say, come out to the shore and wave for us. And when the Fortune at last finally entered Plymouth Bay, she was seen to be a friendly English ship, and the settlers were delighted and much relieved. But during the transit from Cape Cod to Plymouth, the Fortune passengers were absolutely shocked and terrified by the barren and bleak shoreline, in the same way that the Mayflower passengers had been. The Fortune passengers found it hard to believe that anything could exist in such a forbidding land. Bradford wrote that they there saw nothing but a naked and barren place. And when they saw the depressing conditions within the colony, such as the limited provisions, the high mortality, the threadbare clothing being experienced by the settlers, they became quite panicked. The passengers were so disheartened and had such misgivings about this place that they even advised the ship's master that they wanted to re-embark and leave if the colony didn't meet their expectations. But they were talked out of that by the master and the ship's crew, although they were promised that if need be, they would be taken down the coast to Virginia. Contrary to the conditions on the Mayflower 1 year earlier, everyone on the Fortune seemed to be in good health upon their arrival. One birth was recorded soon after they arrived. Martha Ford gave birth to a son, although her husband, Mr. Ford, we're not exactly sure of what his first name was, may have died around that time, and the son very probably died not long afterwards. On the ship were a large number of non-religious passengers, having been given the sobriquet of strangers, and many of them were single men who would greatly outnumber the single marriageable females in the colony. With the arrival of the Fortune, the colony had a total of 66 men and just 16 women of all ages. And this situation regarding the shortage of women may have come about partly as a result of the many deaths in the winter of 1620 and 1621. For every eligible female, there were 6 eligible men. Another problem that concerned the Fortune arrivals was that there were no accommodations for them in this little colony. Bradford was forced to divide the Fortune passengers among the pre-existing 7 houses and 4 public buildings. That's all of the buildings that there were at the time, a total of 11. Some of those buildings were converted into virtually, I think, what you could call male dormitories for the many young men. The problem that most concerned the colony was the continuing shortage of food that they had. This was made far more severe by the arrival of the Fortune. Weston in London had not provided any provisions for the settlement on board the Fortune. And instead of making the colony situation stronger, which was the idea, the arrival of 36 more persons to feed, with the second severe winter for the colony coming on, had put things in what would be a disastrous situation. Bradford calculated that even if their daily rations were reduced to half, then their store of corn would only last for, at most, 6 more months. And after having worked tirelessly for that last year and experiencing extreme hardships since their arrival 1 year earlier, they would now face another hard winter with a shortage of provisions. Bradford wrote, They were presently put to half allowance, one as well as another, which began to be hard, but they bore it patiently under hope of future supply. There is no passenger list for the Fortune in this voyage of 1621. Various historians have attempted to come up with a list, and that is and what I have here is the best that I can do. I have a book coming out. It's currently at the printers, and that is from looking at, for example, the Plymouth land records from 1623 and from other records later on. This is the best I can do to come up with all 35 of the passengers. And most of the previous historians have only been able to come up with about 32. The book that I have that's coming out, called Passengers of the Fortune, 1621, gives a genealogical sketch of each one of these people and talks also about the scholarship about this voyage. The ship didn't even carry food to sustain the crew on the return trip. So they had to load them up in order to give them food for the return trip back to England. The adventurers also sent a letter castigating the planters in Plymouth for the fact that the Mayflower had arrived in England with an empty hold, and demanding that the Fortune return immediately filled with valuable goods. And to prove to the adventurers that they were serious about repaying the debt that was owed to Weston, the colony spent 2 weeks in December of 1621, loading the Fortune with hogsheads of beaver skins, otter skins, sassafras, clapboards made from split oak to be used in the making of barrel staves. The value of the cargo was between 400 and 500 pounds, so maybe about $20,000 or $30,000 nowadays, which would come close to reducing the colony's debt to the adventurers by half. The Fortune stayed in Plymouth for just about 2 weeks. And on the 13th of December, or the 23rd of December in New Style dates of 1621, she got underway for her return voyage to London. On board, going back, was Robert Cushman, who had left his 14-year-old son Thomas in the colony in the care of Governor Bradford. Cushman carried, in addition to Bradford's letter back to Weston, a manuscript that would become an invaluable historic recording of the Pilgrim's first 13 months in America. It was known as Mort's Relation. Believed to be written mostly by Bradford and Edward Winslow, it recounts the first Thanksgiving and the abundance of the New World, so that it was certainly trying to encourage people to come and join them. However, Fortune was not with the ship of that name on the return to England. Apparently, due to a major navigation error, the ship sailed hundreds of miles off course from England, southeast into France's Bay of Biscay, off the coast of Vendée, north of La Rochelle. Almost 5 weeks into her voyage, on the 19th of January, 1622, and not far from the fortified Isle Dieu, a French warship, according to some records, according to other records, a pirate ship showed up. And it seems that the Fortune's master mistook the long peninsula of Brittany in western France for the Lizard Peninsula on the southwestern end of England, and then strayed off down the French Atlantic coast to be taken by a hostile French ship. And even though the Fortune wasn't considered an enemy ship, and certainly not a warship, France at this time was undergoing Huguenot rebel activities, and any English vessel coming close to their coast was suspected of aiding the rebels and was liable for search and seizure. The French warship stopped and boarded the Fortune and then seized everything. And although the Fortune was not carrying any armament or contraband, the French governor seized her guns, her cargo, and all of her rigging. The governor then locked the ship's master in a dungeon and kept Cushman and the crew on board under guard. He also confiscated the manuscript of Mort's Relation, and after 13 days they were freed with the manuscript in Cushman's possession, but without its cargo of valuable beaver skins and sassafras and boards, and the Fortune finally arrived back into the Thames on the 17th of February of 1621, Old Style, and 1622, New Style. The loss of the Fortune's valuable cargo dealt a severe financial loss to the merchant adventurers, who by this time had little hope of recouping their investment in either ship. Note that they had sent two out by this time and had only gotten a couple of people back and no money. And due to this, the merchant adventurers were reorganized in 1626 in conjunction with the Plymouth colony leaders in an effort to restructure the financial arrangements and for Plymouth colony to eventually pay its creditors. In October of 1622, the ship Paragon, with 67 passengers, came out by what was called private men's purses. These are people who are paying their own way and are not being sent by the merchant adventurers. But they had to return to England 2 weeks later because it was leaking from storm damage. The captain of the Paragon was William Pierce. He died in 1641. And in the early history of the colonies, he crossed the Atlantic more times than any other captain, bringing settlers to the New World. He was on very intimate terms with all of the leading colonists, and he was a warm friend of both Winslow and Bradford. He had homes in London, in the Bahamas, and eventually in Boston. It's not established whether he was the brother of John Pierce of the Pierce patent fame. The Admiralty court records on the Paragon show testimony by Thomas Hughes that it was struck by a great storm on the 8th of February in 1622-23 near the Western Isles on a voyage from London to New England. The ship's boat was lost, much damage was suffered, and much of the cargo was washed overboard. The Paragon made another attempt to reach Plymouth at the end of February in 1623, but apparently it was driven back by North Atlantic weather, and it never did reach Plymouth. By this point, Bradford was writing in his journal about an almost total lack of food. The principal backer of the Paragon was John Pierce, who suffered great loss as a result of the voyage. This appears to be the reason why, as one of the adventurers wrote to Bradford on the 9th of April in 1623, that at great cost we have got Mr. John Pierce to assign over the great patent to the company. He charging them £500 for what had cost him £50, presumably in order to recoup some of his losses That's the example of the Pierce patent. In the spring of 1623, about 90 passengers embarked. This is another year later, so we're up to 1623. About 90 passengers embarked in two small ships, sailing from London to the Plymouth colony for the purpose of providing settlers and other colony support. These were the 140-ton supply ship Anne and the smaller but brand new 44-ton pinnace Little James, which had been outfitted for military service. They were financed by Thomas Weston's investment group, the Merchant Adventurers, which is the same one that had financed the Mayflower in 1620 and the Fortune in 1621. After a 3-month voyage, the Anne arrived in Plymouth, according to Bradford, on the 10th of July of 1623, and the Little James arrived a week or about 10 days later. And after this voyage, the Little James was to remain in the colony for fishing and cargo and military service, and the Anne was to return to its regular cargo and shipping work. The Anne's master was William Pierce, and the Little James actually had 2 young men in charge. The master, whose name was John Bridges, and as the master mariner, and a novice captain, first voyage, Emmanuel Altham, who was one of the merchant adventurers. When the crew of the Little James signed on for the voyage, they agreed to spend 6 years in Plymouth colony, but as shareholders rather than as wage earners. And what they expected was to make a lot of money by receiving a share of the ship's profits, particularly from fishing and trading, with the ship's investors paying for the crew's food and drink and clothing. The armament of the Little James was 6 small cannons with a bore of about 2 inches, which could fire a ball of a few pounds in weight. Her men had 6 muskets, and because the ship was armed, the crew believed that they had a chance to take prize ships of enemy nations, such as France and Spain, as far south as the West Indies. I guess that's where they'd go for the winter. But the crew was disappointed to find out that under the law of the sea, prizes could only be taken if the ship had letters of marque issued by the crown. And the Little James, in fact, had none. And en route from England to Plymouth, Captain Altham refused to capture a French ship sailing home to La Rochelle in France, which caused his crew a whole lot of annoyance. On board the Little James were 2 crewmen who would go on to cause a great deal of trouble, as we'll hear later on, and end up in an Admiralty inquiry. A gunner by the name of William Stevens, or either with PH or V, and a carpenter named Thomas Fell, both of whom knew how badly the ship needed their services, particularly as a cooper and as a carpenter. After arriving at Plymouth in the new colony and seeing the shabby state of the colony and the condition of the colonists, some working, others just laying around, the crew believed that they had been fooled and deceived. And at that, Stevens and Fell led the crew to go on strike in a demand for an interim payment of cash, of which there wasn't a lot. William Bradford managed to calm them down, but only after he offered personally to pay them off himself. Working on the coast of New England, the Little James had 2 major problems. First, the investment company the adventurers, had neglected to provide the ship with any trade goods, making it close to impossible to obtain any of the really prime furs that the Indians had in order to ship them to England. And second, the ship was rudely manned by a crew that was not at all happy with their financial situation of being paid in company shares instead of with true wages. In the spring of 1624, Altham took the Little James east to Maine with a sullen, hungry, mutinous crew. And while they anchored at Pemaquid on a fishing and trading expedition, the crew mutinied and threatened Altham and the master, Bridges, with the destruction of the ship. The crew forced Altham to go back to Plymouth in a small boat in order to find food. And with the help of Edward Winslow, Altham rushed back to Pemaquid with some bread and peas. And they were within 1 day's sail of reaching the Little James when they found that a second storm had disabled the ship in the harbor at Damaris Cove Island, which is now in Maine, when the English seamen maintained a small fishing station. And on the night of the 10th of April in 1624, during another storm, the ship lost the grip of her anchors on the seafloor once again, when the wind and the waves forced her to crash into rocks and topple over. And as the ship went over, 2 large holes were opened in her structure, drowning the master, John Bridges, in the wreck and killing 2 crewmen, John Vow and Peter Morritt, when their escape boat capsized and was struck by the falling mainyard of the Little James. You can see where that island is in what is now Maine, but at the time was part of the Massachusetts colony, the colony in Massachusetts. It's the little red arrow there towards the south and western end of the Maine coast. Again, Stevens and Fell at this point mutinied, and they refused to help save the ship. Fortunately, the masters of several other ships that were in the port at Damaris Cove Island, and that's a picture of it, a current picture in the lower right-hand corner there, and they were available to inspect the Little James wreck and found that she was in fact fit for salvage. They contacted William Bradford, offering to salvage the ship if the colony would pay its bill, would meet the cost of their bill in beaver skins. And Bradford sent the furs, and work began with the ship's carpenters and coopers, making great watertight barrels that would be tied to the Little James. And with that help, the ship, with the rising waters, was lifted off the rocks. All hands worked to haul the ship to a secure location nearby, where craftsmen made repairs at great expense to the company. Within 6 weeks of the shipwreck, the Little James was ready for sea again. But by this time, the investors had become thoroughly frustrated by the misadventures of the Little James, which became quite costly to repair instead of making a good profit, which was their intent. And at this point, William Bradford decided to send the ship and its crew back to England. The wreck had been a tragedy, not only for the ship, but also for her captain. In the wreck, the ship had lost her 4 small boats, which were really important for doing coastal trading and business, as well as all of her salt and codfish and all of her supplies and trading goods. Captain Altham lost all of his books and most of his belongings. The Little James had been built by the adventurers to stay in New England and could have been a great boon to the colonists, but it was plagued by bad fortune. A mutinous crew, a shipwreck, seizure by creditors in England after it was salvaged. By the trading season of 1625, the Little James was again sailing the Atlantic in support of Plymouth Colony, investors having sent her and another ship over to fish for cod. And at that time, the colony had debts in the amount of 1,300 pounds. And to settle these debts, this quantity being far beyond their ability to collect, the colony arranged for the Little James to transport about 500 beaver furs to England to assist in paying their debts. But in the continuing ill fortune for the Little James, the cargo never reached its intended English port. Somewhere in the English Channel, almost within sight of the English coast, the Little James was captured by pirates, with all of her cargo taken, and with the valuable beaver pelts being sold cheaply for 4 pence each in the North African Barbary pirate bazaars of Algiers or Tunis. The Little James and the Anne, however, did bring over the first cattle and the first sheep, thus helping the food situation in the colony. The Anne, its companion ship, was a supply ship of about 140 tons displacement, a bit smaller thus than the Mayflower. It was used in 1623 along with the Little James to deliver a large contingent of new settlers to Plymouth Colony. The Anne was the larger of the two ships, and most of the passengers traveled in her. The Anne's master was William Pierce, a young man of Radcliffe in London, and he was a member of the Adventurers Investment Group and had many transatlantic voyages. William Bradford, as quoted by the author Charles Edward Banks, gives the date of the arrival of the Anne at Plymouth as being the 10th of July, 1623, with the pinnace, the Little James, arrival being, according to Bradford, about a week or so after. Caleb Johnson reports that the Little James arrived in Plymouth on August 5th, 1623. And soon after its arrival, the crew of the Anne went to work loading cargo of whatever timber and beaver skins could be provided as cargo and sailed straight back across the Atlantic to home. According to Bradford's later recollections, 60 persons, men, women, and children, were on the two ships, the Anne and the Little James, combined, although in reality the number of passengers were much more than that. There, again, are no separate passenger lists for the Anne and for the Little James, as those who came over on those ships were grouped together in official records when the 1623 division of land was made for them. But the author, Charles Banks, did identify at least 4 men, 3 of them with families, who were passengers on the Little James. And Banks went on to state that it was possible that the Little James had more passengers, but due to her size, she couldn't really have accommodated very many. This is the list, as I've been able to put it together, of the passengers on the Anne, and assuming that there were that they are identified correctly in the land division of 1623. Some of them that you can see already had connections, like, for example, Fear and Patience Brewster, the daughters of Edward William Brewster, coming over from Leyden. One, for example, Mary Beckett, an unattached woman, which is very odd. So she must have some connection with someone else on that ship. And she is the one who married George Soule, the Mayflower passenger. Of particular significance are the wife and daughters of Richard Warren, Elizabeth Walker, married name Warren, the wife of Richard Warren. He was already over, having been a Mayflower passenger. He came over with his 5 daughters, and there they are, and their eventual husbands. They were unmarried at that particular point. There are a number of others, a number of other passengers that have been identified. In some cases, we don't know their full names. In other cases, they are well documented. And here are the 15 passengers of the Little James. The Little James was not all that big and was probably the ship which carried a lot of the cargo and provisions that were being brought over. Here, notice the Mortons. George Morton, the author, possibly with William Bradford and Edward Winslow, of Mort's Relations, and members of his family, as well as the Jennies in the colony. Bradford stated that some of the new settlers that came over in the Anne and the Little James were useful persons and became good members to the body. Some, however, were the wives and children of men who were already there. Some, since the Fortune came over in 1621. But Bradford also stated about those unfit for such a hardship settlement. And he wrote that some were so bad as they were fain to be at charge to send them home again next year. And the state of the passengers is relayed in an apologetic letter sent by Robert Cushman, the former Leiden agent in London, to Bradford. And he said, "It grieveth me to see so weak a company sent to you, and yet, had I not been here, they had been weaker still. Such and such came without my consent, but the importunity of their friends got promise of our treasurer in my absence." From these statements, it can be learned that the reason that so many of the first arrivals disappeared from Plymouth after a few years of experiencing that hardship situation was that they returned. Many of the emigrants on the Anne and the Little James would eventually be sent back to England as unfit for the task of living and working in a harsh colonial environment. Although the English ships bringing new colony settlers did not come out until the Anne and the Little James arrived in the summer of 1623, Plymouth colony was not entirely isolated. English fishing boats and some ships financed by colonization ventures did call at the colony from time to time. Edward Winslow recorded that in June or July 1622, 2 ships, the Charity and the Swan, financed by Thomas Weston, came into Plymouth Harbor. The ships carried about 50 or 60 colonists, and they were scheduled to settle, however, in areas outside of Plymouth. And also the ship Discovery, in a 1622 voyage from Virginia to England, made a short visit to Plymouth with a letter written by passenger John Porey, who was an official of Jamestown, written in high praise of the colony, giving information about its status when he got back to England. As the years went by, more English fishing boats came out to the New England coast. In 1624, The year after that, Captain John Smith reported there has been a fishing this year upon the coast about 50 English ships, so that the isolation of the first couple of years seems to have abated for the Plymouth colony. However, of course, within about 4 or 5 years, the beginnings of what is called the Great Migration would bring far more to the area immediately north of Plymouth and into the area around Boston with the foundation of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So that's the story of the first 4 ships, only 3 of which, the first 4 ships, only 3 of which actually made it to Plymouth, and the first 3 years of the Plymouth colony. So I guess now we can take some questions.
Thank you very much, Beckett. It was a fascinating journey to follow those back and forth there. We do have a number of questions, some even that were shared before the program. So we'll go ahead and get started. But I also wanted to just let you know that we have visitors joining us all the way from England and the Netherlands, even Australia, and certainly across the country. So welcome everybody, and a lot of sharing of their ancestry as well. So they've all been doing a lot of homework. But let's go ahead and get started with some of the questions. So one that came in before was, so when the Mayflower set sail, is there any information that there were follow-on voyages planned to help supply, and what had been sort of the arrangement for that?
Well, certainly the idea, I mean, the big idea was that the Mayflower, once it got to America, was going to send back a number of things which could be sold for in order to not only pay back the investors, but also to support the colony. So that the idea was that that there were things going to be going back and forth. A lot of the sense that I get is that this hadn't been entirely thought through as well. So that, for example, it went back, it had some trading goods that they had gotten from the local Indians, but a lot of rocks for ballast, which was not particularly needed in England. But they couldn't send the Mayflower back. It had been very heavily loaded coming over, but it didn't have much that was not going to stay there. So they just simply loaded a whole bunch of rocks and had a little bit, and that got the investors very angry. When the Fortune came over, it mostly brought people. It didn't bring anything else, but then they loaded up a number of things in order to send it back and to sell it off, particularly the case of furs, and that got confiscated when it hit the French coast and miscalculated. But eventually, the idea was that most of the congregation from Leiden was going to come over, and now it took quite a long period of time, well over a decade, in order for that to happen. But there was no plan for kind of a regular shuttle for that. It just depended upon when you could get it and how much money was available, because these were expensive in order to send something over. And I think, as I said, I think in a lot of respects, this really hadn't been thought through, because starting a colony was not something that had happened very frequently. And so there was no how-to book, colonization for dummies or something. And that was I think it's interesting to that Edward Winslow sent back a very long letter saying, if you're going to start a colony, here's some stuff that you need to do. And for example, it talks about what kind of animals you should bring over and what kind of foodstuffs and things like that. And this works and this doesn't. And I think that's a really interesting read.
And can you just share quickly, because there's some questions about some of those things, the titles, Mort's Relation and Good News from New England.
Right. So
yeah.
So that one of the main sources, of course, is of Plymouth Plantation. This was William Bradford's journal, which he started and very early on, and then he stopped, and then he started up again, and he finished it with the famous list of Mayflower passengers in 1651. At the end of that, Mort's Relation was a series of things that were written in for the first 13 months or so of the voyage. It starts right about the time that they got there, and then the manuscript was sent back with the Fortune in November of 1621, November and December of 1621, and this was published in 1622, 1623. And it sold like hotcakes because this was the first news that people could get of this particular group. Good News from New England was from Edward Winslow, and this was almost trying to encourage people to come out and to tell not only the religious side of the story, the motivations for starting there, but also the things which happened to them in order to encourage people to come out. There are also, and this was published, I think, originally in the 1920s, and it has been republished since. There were 3 letters that were written, one from, as I mentioned, John Pori from Jamestown, who was an official of Jamestown, who stopped in on his way back to England, one from an official from New Amsterdam, which was being started at just about this time. And these letters were sent back to England, and they were published originally as separate tracts and eventually collected, and so that we can see what people who were visitors very early on saw. And the last thing is the first published sermon. So Robert Cushman preached a sermon, oddly enough, about money, to the people while he was there. He came on the Fortune, and then in November preached a sermon during one of their worship services in order to encourage people to pay their debts and to sign the arrangement that the merchant adventurers had sent over for them to sign. And this sermon was written and sent back with Cushman. And the first part is about money. And the second part, apparently, which made quite an impression on people, was about friendship. The first part was published. I have yet to find the text of the second part of that sermon. If you're reading it, it probably takes you a good hour in order to read the whole thing, out. This was published in 1624 in England, and thus is probably the first published sermon in American history.
And I just want to let people know who are asking about some of these things that the sources that Beckett has mentioned, a lot of them have been published, and they are accessible through bookstores, all over today. 3 Visitors to Plymouth, Mort's Relations, Good News from New England, and I think it's Cry of the Stone, right? the Cushman.
Robert
Yeah.
Cushman, yeah.
So, right, all available. So here's a question about from Peter that asks, was there any attempt by any of the original Plymouth settlers who survived the first winter to return to England on the Mayflower's return trip in 1621 or later on, the Fortune or any of the other ships? We do get that question a lot.
Yeah.
Here at the Alden House. People think, wow, I think I just want to get on the boat and go home.
That's an interesting question, because so Christopher Jones, the captain of the Mayflower, said, "I'll take back anybody who wants to go," and no one took him up on it. And there are a number of, I think, very, very emotional, moving paintings of all of the Mayflower passengers standing on the shore watching the Mayflower go back. And at this point, they had not had any connection, with anybody else from England. They had only a couple of weeks previous had their first connections with Samoset and the natives in the area. But Moses Fletcher is the only one of the original Mayflower passengers who we know went back. And so he has descendants, and thus they could be Mayflower. They could be Mayflower members of the Mayflower Society. Most of them are in Holland. However, Moses Fletcher, so far as I know, is the only one, and there may be one other, a woman by the name of Cooper, who was one of John Carver's servants. She married, but I believe she eventually went back to England. As far as the Mayflower passengers, those are the only two that went back to the other side of the Atlantic.
So another question, and this is another question that we get here at the museum is, some of the members of the Leiden congregation do come, but what happened to the rest of them? Those that never made it across to New England?
Well, as you may know, John Robinson, who was the minister, the pastor of the Leiden congregation, died a couple of years later, and the congregation, the person that you need to really ask about that is the one who has done a lot of the works, Jeremy Bangs, in his book Strangers. I'm trying to remember the full name of this, but I know it starts with strangers, but it talks about the Leiden congregation and those who stayed, and probably a majority of the congregation. Now, this is just simply a guess, and I don't know figures. A majority of the congregation eventually did come over, but a substantial part stayed. And ultimately, I think it eventually, I guess, assimilated into the larger community there in Leiden. I think that, one of the things, looking at the passenger list of the Fortune, most of them come from London. And because the Mayflower gets back to England, it took them about a month. So a third of the time it took them to go over. It comes back in about a month. And Thomas Weston says, gosh, we need to get a lot of people really quickly. And so within a month, they sent the Fortune out. You couldn't go recruit people. You had to get people really quickly. And almost all of them are from London, which is where the Fortune left from. So people like, for example, Philip Delano, We know that he had connections with the Leiden congregation, and the most obvious explanation for what happened with him is that he was originally on the Speedwell. We know that he has connections with, for example, Francis Cook, because his aunt is Francis Cook's wife. And I mean, this isn't proven because we don't have any passenger lists for the Speedwell. But if he came to England when they rearranged everybody after the Speedwell came back and was eventually abandoned, he said, "That's fine, guys. You know, I'll take the next one over." And in fact, he did. So about a year later, he is waiting around in London, or in the area, and he hears about the ship going over and that he can finally continue his journey in that way. And that may be because a number of these people, so there is a Winslow that comes on the Fortune, there's a Brewster that comes on the Fortune, so that there are a number of people who have connections in addition to a number of people that are very nicely called lazy by the people in Plymouth when they actually get there. But we know of some of the connections of Philip Delano.
So another question that came in earlier was, you have, obviously the saints or the Leiden congregation, and then you have, the other passengers, nicknamed, I guess, are called the strangers, those who aren't part of the Leiden congregation. So then you have these succeeding ships. So how does how did that work in terms of just, people, learning to get along with, everyone in this very small colony that, where the leadership is, Bradford and, the Leiden congregational members. So do you, any sense of how that all works?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was, well, 3 points, and perhaps very briefly. When they signed the Mayflower Compact, so this is the Mayflower, and this is obviously very early on, about at least a quarter, and perhaps as much of a third of the men on the Mayflower did not sign. And I've always wondered how that affected. So you've got about 2/3 of the people say, yeah, we're going to, we agree to work together and to do all of this. And then about a quarter, or perhaps as much as a third, don't sign that, but they still stay. So it's not like they were part of the crew and then immediately went back. And that shows a certain amount of tension very early on. Secondly, of course, is the celebration of Christmas, which was not done by the Puritans and the Pilgrims, but those who were not of that same religious tradition said to Bradford, yeah, you need to let us take the day off because it's Christmas. And he says, okay, you can take the day off, if you treat this as a Sabbath. And they wind up playing games, and this gets Bradford furious. No, you need to spend this as a religious day, and therefore, take it as the Sabbath and a day of rest, and not play games and do things like that. So you can see that, and that's very early on in all of this. That's the first Christmas there. The third is that one of the things that you read in the last half of Bradford's journal is that it's very, very dark. He feels in a number of ways that the Plymouth colony was a failure because they did not retain the same religious zeal that brought them there in the first place. He felt that people were just coming out there in order to make a name for themselves or in order to make money. And the last half of Bradford's journal of Plymouth Plantation, I think, is very dark. And and that he's very sad because he really feels that this was a failure, and that is that they're no longer able to attract people in the way that they're no longer able to attract the right kind of people, and in Bradford's mind. And so I think that is that's a third part of that. So yes, there were tensions all the way along. And we find particularly John Oldham, who was an Anglican minister who came out very early on and caused lots and lots of trouble, doing things like baptizing people and celebrating sacraments. And this was not something that they wanted to see, because they had gotten there in order to get away from the Church of England.
So a question from Terry is, so how much, what was the fare for securing a place on these ships? And, maybe also from another person, the ways that you paid, how could you, how would you pay for this fare if you couldn't put up the money?
Yeah, it varied. And I think people have tried to calculate this. And because in the case of the Mayflower, the Fortune, the Anne, and the Little James, these ships were outfitted by the merchant adventurers. So you would pay something, but you wouldn't pay kind of full fare. In the case of the Paragon, everybody paid, in a sense, paid their own way. But the Paragon didn't make it there. I have seen, because one of the ways that you paid, for example, was an indenture. So you said there were a number of indentured servants, even though this is now considered to be tantamount to slavery. In that period, this was pretty standard, and a significant percentage of the people in New England came over as indentured servants. You said that you would work without pay for a particular period of time. 5 years, 7 years were the most common indentures, sometimes 3, sometimes more. But that someone else would then pay your way. And the amounts that I have seen for this, and it depended, I mean, just like, different kinds of fares. It could be as low as maybe about 7 or 8 pounds. It could be as high as 20 pounds for what would cost you to come over. And it depended how much comfort you wanted to have, because we know more about the ships in the Great Migration, the ones that came in 1630 and more. So we don't have any like tickets for the Mayflower or the Fortune or something like that. But that in the case of an indenture, so that, for example, Edward Winslow, who came over with his wife, and he had 3 servants, George Soule, Elias Story, and then one of the Moore children, who was, as they say, bound to him during this journey. Elias Story, we hear nothing about him. We assume that he may have died, and also with the Moore children. So that William Bradford's list says that that the 2 others died, but that his man George Soule is still with us and has married and has 8 children. George Soule had 1 more. But the indenture typically was for maybe 5 to 7 years, sometimes as little as 3. You could not marry during that period, but basically the person to whom you were indentured would take care of all of your expenses, and when you finished, had to supply you with a little money and a suit of clothes so that you could start your own life. And that was so that was how that worked. Many of them came over as indentured servants. or their way was paid by somebody else. And that's how they were able to afford it. So you didn't have to be wealthy in order to come over, but there were some people who were wealthy, like Edward Winslow, and he came over. His wife had just come into her inheritance, so he was, I guess, as we would say, is flush with cash.
So I know we're getting close to our time, and people have asked absolutely wonderful questions. If we haven't had a chance to answer them, I will share them with Beckett, and we'll try to get answers to you on all of them. But one last one to wrap this up, and that is how and when can we get copies of your book?
Right. The book called Passengers of the Fortune 1621 is going to be published by Heritage Books from Baltimore. And I am absolutely certain that the Alden House is going to stock it. Hint, hint. And but yeah, Heritage Books in Baltimore is the one who is publishing it. Also, you can see on the slide there, I think it's probably still up, and then I'm going to take it down, but my email, wbsoul1620@gmail.com, if you want to get in touch with me directly. That's probably the best way to do that. And I will be at the Alden reunion, to give a plug for that, in August, talking about prosecutions for fornication in the Plymouth colony, and then talking about, well, Rebecca Alden, my ancestor, and Dr. Thomas Delano, speaking of prosecutions for fornication. And I'm sure it's going to be a great time at the beginning of August. And so if you want to actually have a conversation about this, well, come, and I'll be happy to sit down and with anybody that's interested, and continue this conversation. So I am going to stop sharing.
So again, everyone, thank you so much for joining. A really special thank you to Beckett for taking the time to do this presentation for us. As he mentioned, the Alden reunion is August 4th to 6th, and we are including the Delanos and the Peter Brown descendants in this wonderful weekend event. So please, some of it will be broadcast online, so please join us. Please check out our website for the schedule of upcoming events. If you're in the Duxbury area, we hope you'll stop by and visit Alden House. It reopens for tours in June. And again, thank you to everyone for joining us. Learn more about the Aldens at the website, alden.org. And we wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, Beckett.